I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm far better off than I sounded there for just a little bit. Advancing America's freedom as well. The other thing, Amy, when we look about birthright citizenship in that big case, you wrote a really good piece that showed up at Fox News. And, this isn't really about hysteria. I think the two big points, one, I'd like to get your sense about really the debate that happened, what you saw from that. But, this is a bigger story that I'm actually kind of a little bit pleased to see some of the people in the press are actually starting to look at things like tourism birth, those types of elements that were brought up during the case. But your sense of what you heard during the arguments.
Yeah, so look, I think even those of us who have always been very adamant that the government's position on this is correct, understood that there's a bit of an uphill battle here, because this is something that, again, for at least the last 60 to 80 years, there's just been this general sort of acceptance. A lot of people have not really looked deeply into this, which I think is unfortunate. And so anytime you have this long-standing presumption, I think it makes it difficult for the court. And it also, even the originalists, right? And it also makes it difficult for those of us who pay attention to the court to really flesh out what some of these justices are thinking, right? Because it's not like with the Second Amendment where a lot of them are on the record. We've seen them in oral arguments on this specific debate before. And so it was kind of difficult to sort of flesh out what was, on some of their minds. You saw a lot of questions actually about what I would call administrability. Okay. Not even about like the original history, but about how would this work, right? Like this line that the government has drawn saying at least one parent has to be a citizen, at least one parent has to be a lawful permanent resident, right? Well, how would this work? How do we determine this? And it's hard to make sense of, well, what do you do with that when the real question should be, what did this mean to the people who wrote it at the time, right? You also then, I think, saw this back and forth about, and I touch on this in my article, this idea of, well, this being revisionist history. You saw this from the ACLU's attorney and from the what I would call the liberal justices, right, of just sort of deriding, not really engaging with the original understanding, but just sort of deriding it as this revisionist history. And there's a certain irony there, because in the strictest sense, yes, the government's position is revisionist against the modern consensus, but when you look at the original history and the original understanding, that modern consensus, this idea that everyone's who's born here is a citizen no matter what, that actually was itself the revisionist history at the time. It sort of won out in a hostile takeover in the early 20th century. And so you saw this sort of battle back and forth. But again, I think there's an uphill battle in the minds of many of those justices. That's just going to make it difficult at the end of the day.
Once again, we're pleased to be joined by Amy Sawyer, of course, once again, Advancing American Freedom. We post that information up online and a link to the article as well, but other stuff that Amy has done on this topic. What is interesting, too, though, Amy, is that, look, anytime we have a chance to discuss the Constitution and certainly the history of the Constitution, this will be one of the more important cases we've had in this new century. One of the things I did find interesting during the debate, and I loved that debate, I thought both attorneys probably could have done a little bit better, but the justices were also getting in, and I don't know if I misread this hint, talking about, well, is there a role for Congress in this? I mean, is it purely just a constitutional, or does Congress actually have a say in defining this a little bit better? Did I misread that, or is that part of a conversation I heard?
No, it certainly is part of the conversation. There is a reality in which the court maybe leaves open this idea, and there's a reason for this, by the way, because we're actually arguing about two things. So you have the constitutional provision, correct, and then you also have a statute that says the exact same thing as the constitutional provision. And so it's this question of, can they say the same thing but mean different things? Because the statute was passed much, much later, when, arguably Congress thought the words meant something different. And so there is this real possibility that perhaps the court says, either we're not going to get to the constitutional question, or we think, the constitutional provision clearly allows Congress to determine, whatever that means. But when Congress did pass this provision, it meant universal birthright citizenship. And that does get interesting then, right? Because that does leave open the door for Congress to now go back and to update that statute and to clarify that's not what we mean, right? To basically do what President Trump's executive order does, but through the legislative branch. And so, yeah, they toyed with that idea quite a bit. Justice Kavanaugh in particular brought that up, and they sort of ran through whether or not that was viable. The question is always, do you have 5 justices who think that that's the proper understanding? And I think that's about as much as a possibility as many of the other outcomes in this case. But it's certainly one that is there.
Yeah, interesting point too, Amy. Once again, Advancing American Freedom. We posted Amy Suarez's information up online. We highly encourage you to read not only this, but she's wonderful when she writes about the Second Amendment as well, or anything related to the Constitution. Amy, the other interesting part about this is that, there is now an interest, and Americans are now being asked, what is the threshold for U.S. citizenship? This is a valuable, I don't want to call it a commodity, but it has a value to it. Our history, and once you become an American citizen, there's a lot of history behind that citizenship. A lot of countries do not offer this. And even people, when they say, well, Canada does, there's variations that you may not understand to the birthright clause in that aspect. Do you think that we're turning a little bit of a corner where Americans say, well, no, I would like to put some provisions on this, such as tourism, in which we now see, 100,000 mothers coming from China or through surrogacy, giving birth to babies and then just bringing them back to China and then having them come back at 18 and participate in our elections or potentially even being a president. Do you think that we're seeing that in the community now, that conversation gets us thinking as a society about how we do want to approach this?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think even if the government loses this case, or sort of, half loses it, this has opened up a societal can of worms. You look at the polling on the issue, and there's actually quite a lot of support for President Trump's executive order for drawing those lines, at least roughly in that place, right? Making sure that citizenship means something other than you just happen to be born on American soil, but you've been raised and identify as, a loyal citizen of the Chinese Communist Party while living in China, right? That's always been popular. Obviously I think some people might split hairs and say, well, it should have been Congress, it shouldn't have been an executive order, but it's popular. And I think, too, just the general discussion that this has brought up from a policy standpoint, the number of people who didn't understand coming into this, the very real national security problems that come with the rise of birth tourism. I think the understanding within the illegal immigration context about the colloquialism anchor baby, right? I think that's been there for a long time. But for a lot of people to find out just how many foreign nationals are coming over here for the sole purpose of being here for a couple of weeks, having a baby, getting that American citizenship documentation, and then taking that kid back to whatever country they came from, though it's often China, Russia, Nigeria is another big one, and raising that child not as an American, right, but as a Chinese citizen or as a Russian citizen who happens to have an American passport, and then later on taking advantage of that once they're a fully functioning adult, but still identifying as not really American.
Right.
And it's a terrifying thing. And for so many people to realize how often that's happening, I think that really changes, again, just the tone of the conversation about what can we do even if the government loses. I mean, to suggest another constitutional amendment, right? For most things, I feel like that's out of the realm of possibilities. For this, I actually think this would be one of the few times and places where I'm like, that would have a shot, because so many people do understand how irrational this current universal birthright citizenship policy is.
Yeah, Amy, I'm glad to hear you say that, too, because I do have that optimism as well. Amy Suarez, of course, AAF, Advancing American Freedom. I do have to, when you look at this, Amy, is that it brings into the jurisdiction thereof, right? That whole clause that way. And if there is any frustration out of this whole case, I think a lot of people are saying, hey, guys, next time, you put down words. Let's make sure we understand exactly what you mean. We need a little bit. This became up very vague, but you pointed out, whether it's back to Nigeria, whether it's back to China, whether it's back to some of the other countries, they truly are not under the jurisdiction thereof. I'll give you an example. If a draft happens and we go out and call for China and Nigeria, and okay, send all your kids who were born here back because we're going to war, they wouldn't surrender them. In fact, we'd probably see a lot of court cases go, no, we're not under jurisdiction at that point. They are Nigerian citizens. It is an interesting debate to have that conversation about what it actually means to be jurisdiction thereof.
Yeah, well, and it's so funny. So I don't go into this in the article, but I did write very recently a longer Larvae article, and I submitted an amicus brief with my colleague Hans von Spakovsky touching on this. That exact point about the draft. When you look at how they developed this language later on about the jurisdiction thereof, many of these same members of Congress just a couple years prior were arguing about that during the Civil War. Who is subject to our jurisdiction so that we can draft them and who's not? Because you had a lot of people who had lived here, for quite a number of times. Some of them, despite not being citizens under state laws, could vote, could hold public office. And all of a sudden, the minute there was a draft, they're like, no. We absolutely are not American citizens. You cannot draft us, right? We're French, we're British, or whatever. And so that's actually where they start drawing those lines and talking about this idea of jurisdiction. And to suggest that, they understood this sort of political jurisdiction to mean, well, just literally anyone who's here except an ambassador. No, because that's not how they implemented it in other respects, exactly like the draft, like you were saying.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, this conversation. I know you've had these wonderful conversations, too, behind closed doors or a little bit more general where you can be calmer and emotion doesn't come into play. I understand where the emotion comes from, but I think this is certainly one of those conversations we need to continue as a country as well. Amy, I didn't get a chance to talk to you about, some of the gun laws we've seen. Can I hold you over just for one more segment? Welcome back, of course. Amy Swearer joins us, of course, from AAF. We post that information up online. It's Advancing American Freedom as well. I have to admit, Amy, that I follow you on X, and I appreciate it when I don't know if it's a pure snark, but it's certainly a 250th anniversary snark. When we look at, make no mistake, Spanberger's game here isn't that she respects your Second Amendment rights like King George III. There we go. That's the slapdown I want to see. When we think about what we're looking at in Virginia, we saw last week in Connecticut, they're trying some of the same maneuvers. We're seeing across the country that states feel emboldened now to advance, removing those rights that we have. Many, like us here in New Hampshire, not only do we have the national right, but we have it enshrined in our state constitution as well. But Virginia is really going after legal firearm ownership to the point that it's quite dangerous, actually.
In Virginia, up until, really right now, it had been pretty okay comparatively on guns when you look at some of our northern neighbors. There's a reason many of us live in Virginia instead of in D.C. or in Maryland, even though the commute is roughly the same. And it's because Virginia historically has at least recognized our right to keep and bear certain types of firearms that are frowned upon in the district. So it's otherwise been pretty decent. And now we've seen this slew of gun bills that essentially would turn us into D.C. or Maryland. Things like the introduction, and these were passed, by the way, things like a quote-unquote a ban on assault weapons sales. You can keep the millions that you have or acquire before July 1st, but, they're so deadly that you can't buy them ever again, but you can keep the ones you have. Things like that, magazine capacity limits, a whole bunch of other stuff, really narrowing down the places where you can bear arms in public, even with a concealed carry permit. And what had happened was for a number of these bills, the governor didn't sign them into law right away. They've just been sitting there. Okay. And we saw the deadline for action to veto or sign come Monday at midnight. And because in Virginia you have this other interesting component with the Democratic legislature's attempts to gerrymander the living daylights out of the state. Yeah. Virginia is kind of a purple state, maybe leans blue recently, but to gerrymander it to make it like a 10-1 state in favor of the Democrats. And there's a vote on this where the deadline is April 21st. And so, there's really this nefarious reason why the governor waited until Monday to take any action on a number of these bills, and then she sort of punted. She sent a number of them back to the legislature with proposals for amendments, which extends the timeline. It's a whole, like inside baseball thing. But the reality is she's doing this because she doesn't want single-issue gun voters to think that she's, some very she doesn't want the bad press of being the anti-gun, governor who's going to take your guns while everyone is voting on whether or not she can also gerrymander the entire state. So it's this hilarious, just sort of half backtracking strategically to try to buy time. But at the end of the day, you look at the proposals. She will almost certainly sign all of them into law the minute she gets them, and once she gets them back from the legislature, and even some of her amendment proposals were amendments to make the bills worse, right? To restrict our rights even more. So it's very unfortunate, and it is, especially in a state like Virginia, where Patrick Henry's whole "give me liberty or give me death" speech occurred. It's very unfortunate to see this happening specifically to this important of a right that helped win the entire revolution.
Yeah, your state has an interesting motto, too. It almost rivals ours here in New Hampshire, live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils. And I think when we look at that bigger thing, we're talking to Amy Swearer, of course, we're talking advancing American freedom as well. Connecticut a few years ago actually banned certain types of weapons. I know you're well aware of this. And they said, anyone who owns them now, you're all set. Don't worry about it. But from this point on, and then last week, what we saw was the final, really where they were going. They introduced legislation saying, no, I don't know why we let you keep them. And in fact, we're not really concerned about the 4th and 5th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. We know who has these guns, and we may come to your home and get them if this law passes. This is really dangerous times when you think about the constitutional rights that are under attack in many states.
Absolutely. And this has been, for years now, Second Amendment advocates like myself have been derided as, sort of these hardline extremists because, well, what do you mean you're not in favor of like this little half step? You can keep the ones you have, right? It's because we've always understood that, one, these general laws that are generally applicable, that largely are targeting law-abiding, ordinary, peaceable citizens, these were never public safety laws. These restrictions never actually targeted the people who are overwhelmingly responsible for violent crime, who are overwhelmingly people who are already prohibited from owning any guns,
right,
and who are dangerous with any gun, and who largely don't need, a pistol grip or a barrel shroud to accomplish their criminal purposes. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we've also understood that it's a stepping stone, right? It's sort of slowly heating up the pot that you're into boiling water without you noticing. Because the end game has always been confiscation. There has not been a single state or national entity outside of the United States that has ever started with, it's just registration. Right? It's just a ban on sales, right? That hasn't then turned it into, well, now it's a ban on possession. And also, because of registration, we know who has them.
Right. And I think that's always been
it is the inevitable outcome.
Yep.
Especially because, again, it has no impact on public safety. And so they pass the first step, and then they say, well, this didn't impact public safety. Well, no, duh, because guess who didn't listen to your laws? The criminals who were already breaking them, right? And then they use it as a means and as a tool to continue cracking down on the wrong people, that is lawful, ordinary gun owners.
Well, absolutely, and I love it when a constitutional scholar says no duh. That's just brilliant wording. Amy Swearer, of course, advancing American freedom as well. We're actually having a conversation right now, Amy, I don't know if you're aware of this, in New Hampshire about permitting campus carry. We have 3 state colleges that do not permit concealed carry on their campuses, but they also don't permit any self-defense tool, whether it's mace, claw, baton, whatever it is. They don't allow any of that on their campuses, and it's been a huge debate this week, and it looks like it's going to pass. But once again, there still are states out there trying to respect that part of not only their state constitution, but the national constitution.
Well, that's great to hear. I mean, we have almost the opposite problem here in Virginia. You remember last month, there was a terrorist attack on an ROTC classroom at Old Dominion University. And it very heroically, a couple of cadets jumped on that gunman. One of them stabbed him to death with a knife. Technically, it was legal for him to carry if it was under a 3-inch knife. That would have been not a weapons violation. But after this, we actually had a delegate here in Virginia point to that as an example of basically, well, gun control is fine because, he just proved you don't always need a gun. Why don't you just stab him? Why don't you take a knife to a gunfight? Right? You'll be fine, as though that's the point of being armed to defend life and liberty, that you're limited to a knife at a gunfight.
Yeah, that is amazing that they would say that once again. And of course, it was, the bravery and the skill of that person that would be able to do that. That wouldn't be something that would normally happen as well. Bigger stuff. Hey, any final thoughts before we let you go, Amy?
Well, I would say this. Always be on the lookout for violations of our constitutional rights and of our liberty. Because again, things can change very quickly, even in states where it seems secure. All it takes is one lost election, one high-profile incident that changes the minds of people who didn't know any better and who don't understand the reality of violent crime and who commits it. And people look for an easy scapegoat. And unfortunately, increasingly that scapegoat seems to be the constitutional rights of ordinary, peaceful citizens.
Well said. I think that would be the last note. Amy, thanks for joining us this morning.